Hello. Hang on. That wasn't one supposed to be live. Hang on. That one's supposed to be live. Hello. Hello. Yes, I got the designs up. And yes, I am tempted to call this series the Telling Everyone About My Aunt's Bet series. Because whilst this one is going to be a response to the video, the questions put on, commented on the Battle Atlantic original video, I am going to start off by quickly saying, hello everyone, I now have a Spreadshirt merchandise, and there is more to come. I also have a very specific thing to do with this Blackburn one. Now, it's much demanded, it has been requested by people, so it has been provided. And talking about it with my aunt led to my aunt making a traditional family bet, because you've known in the past, my family do like to operate by bets. And my aunt and uncle have betted this. They will buy, and have actually ordered, I've checked on the Spreadshirt system, 2 face masks with the Blackburn on. And if I get to 13,000 subscribers, because they say double, and I'm currently 6,400, so let's round it up and say 13,000 subscribers, by the end of 2021, that's December the 31st, 2021, there will be a picture of them for Sunday the 2nd of January 2022, both wearing Blackburn face masks. And I've actually added that on Discord, link again to that down below, like a link to Spreadshirt is down below, that I'll be wearing one as well, because that seems nice. But more importantly, I get a lot of family bragging rights. And I know this happened before, but what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. If you like the videos, can you please share, like, spread them around as much as possible, and make sure you subscribe, because I would love those bragging rights, and I'd also love to have that picture. Anyway, getting on with today's topic. And today's topic, of course, I'm going to be using the slides from the original, not from the redo, rather than the original, because there are more of them, and because there are a lot of comments, so I think I will need them. Okay. Hieroglyph. I thought Battle of Atlantic was yesterday. This is 7 of 7. Wile E. Coyote goes to war, not Battle of Atlantic, lol. Right? No. This was the original recording, and I looked through it and thought I could do better, so I did. Hieroglyph. Germany actually got good at rapid manufacture of U-boats, Adrian J. And when they did, historians complained they are not the latest and greatest, the same historians that laud the Sherman tank for its mass production. True. They're perfectly decent. They are not the latest and greatest. They're not the Type 21 or Type 23. But they're perfectly capable Type 7s, and they're churning out a huge number of them. It's kind of like the Panzer IV, which is, let's be honest, the backbone of the Panzer armies and the German army for most of World War II. In fact, for all of World War II. The only reason it's not in service for for as long a time as the Matilda is because the Matilda tank is in service with the Australians versus the Japanese till the very end of the war, because the Matilda's particular virtue of having mahusively thick armor really helps in fighting the Japanese. The thing is, you will often get this with various history books, and I remember a friend of mine recently was talking about how top 10 U-boats, or top 10, and it was in the Brewster Buffalo video put out by Military Aviation History, I think, and the Brewster Buffalo for some reason always fits, is in the 10 worst aircraft of World War II. It's not an amazing aircraft, but it's not the 10 worst, and it's always the same ones which fit in there. It's always, if you ever look at those 10 lists, they're always, and makes the point again, they're always the same. They're just juggled around. It's the same with submarines. It's the same with ships. It's always the same ones. You sit there and go, no, they're not really. There is always context. There is always something going on. The whole point about the Battle Atlantic is that it is a hard and nasty fight, but it is in no way a one-way fight. It's also the fact is that you are dealing with, whilst the Germans produce a very small number of very high quality subs, some which never get into service, and the vast majority of their submarines in service are fairly decent, but not not massively brilliant. It's the same with escorts. Let's be honest. The anti-submarine frigates and sloops and the specialist Black Swan sloops are by far the smallest bunch of escorts out there in terms of numbers. Versus, I suppose the Hunt class destroyers would fit in the higher quality escort range, but Flower class corvettes, Castle class corvettes to an extent, trawlers, the huge numbers of old destroyers converted into long range escorts. They're all useful. They are all perfectly serviceable as escorts, and they do a fine job. But that's because they're doing a fine job versus their equivalents in terms of submarine terms. And this is the point. Again, I often make this. War is about logistics, war is about supply, war is about sustainment, and you go to war with what you have, not what you want to have, what you have. It's a very serious point. It's what you have, not what you want to have. Hieroglyph. Even Donitz knew it was over in 1943 Black May. Difference was hedgehogs. ASW mortars were a war-winning technology. Depth charges suck. You have to know the depth of the target, and they make so much noise that whoever is listening with hydrophones has to take a break. Actually, the really interesting thing with depth charges is usually what they do is they take more than one ship to involve them. They don't actually suck. The problem is they do take more than one ship to do engagement. The thing with a ASW mortar, like a hedgehog, what you can do is one ship can maintain ASDIC contact and have the monitoring and fire the mortar, and it can be a one or even maybe two ship engagement of a submarine. Usually, with depth charges, what you need is 2 to 3 ships per submarine to hunt the submarine in a pack. So you have packs hunting packs. It gets quite fun. And one ship has to maintain ASDIC contact with the submarine, so they have the depth and, well, roughly the depth and roughly its position. And another ship goes over it with depth charges, laying a pattern of depth charges, and then another ship from another direction comes through and lays another pattern of depth charges on top. And that's how you get the kill. And you do get the kill that way, but it's not exactly easy. And it requires a lot of coordination and a lot of work. Hedgehogs and later squids make it far easier. Or rather, far more straightforward. Never easy. Hieroglyph. All those escort carriers also made the U-boat war much, much harder. No more mid-Atlantic air gap. Ben Wilson. Also used in the Arctic convoys. Look up PQ-18. Yeah. The escort carriers are really, really useful. Hieroglyph. World War II, and after all, that's what the Royal Navy had been using Argus and Hermes and Eagle to an extent to test the concept of in various exercises in the interwar years. And what they'd actually had some fast liners set aside for with the idea of doing, but then of course the liners get used for troop transports, and then they were also considering, they also had plans for their own tankers, and their own tankers are being used for running fuel and doing all sorts of things. Eventually they managed to work out other ships can be used for the role, but it's one of those scenarios where you sit there and go, if you'd had someone like Henderson in charge still, rather than, for all his lovely abilities, Fraser, who was not the most innovative thinker in the world as Third Sea Lord, you might have had a better chance of actually coming up with that solution earlier. He's a perfectly serviceable and good admiral, but he's kind of like a Calder versus Nelson's versus Henderson's. I would go more Collingwood than Nelson. Hieroglyph. World War II subs cannot outrun World War II escorts, but can outrun freighters on the surface. Submerged, they can outrun nothing, except for the Type 21 and 23. Yeah. Hieroglyph. Soups, I presume, are effective for anti-submarine warfare, but basically coastal boats, right? No. As I said, look up the Black Swan class. To be fair, not even the trawlers would stay just the coast. None of sloops are just coastal ships. Hieroglyph. Your battle plan faces two problems. I'm evil. Two, I'm suicidal. I don't have to win. You just have to lose. Horrible jokes aside, I should look it up. I love the Einbahn bots, types 1 to 3, but I don't think building a bunch of them instead of type 7C was the way to go. And yeah, late model 7s are significantly better than the early model. True. Which is another problem with starting construction in earlier 1930s. The earlier you start producing the massive submarines, the less capable your submarines are going to be. Hieroglyph. World War II crackpot ideas. The following are crackpot ideas. Doesn't look crackpot, is totally crackpot. V1 and V2 rockets, Japanese submarine aircraft carriers, Sherman duplex drive tanks. Okay. Looks crackpot because it is. Russian dog mines. I think that's also cruelty to dogs. Icecraft carrier, Habakak, or whatever it's called. That's a crackpot scheme, but actually fairly logical. And let's be honest, even today, that thing would have so much mass. Imagine trying to take it out. It's kind of like a thing of, we're taking it out? Really? We are? What we're using? How many hypersonic missiles? Russian flying tanks and all super heavy tanks. Yes. Questionable. Searchlight tanks. German drone panzers, Goliath, and there was another much larger one, but mostly only used on the Western Front. Useful for laying wire, but for driving explosives into enemy positions, not so much. German submarine tank. It's a tank and a mini-sub. I honestly haven't heard of that one before, but I'm going to hunt it down. Not crackpot, but sure looks it. Audio phones to detect inbound aircraft. That was actually a very clever idea. German gigantic glider transport. I'm sorry, I'm not a fan of glider aircraft, but I do understand the idea. Submarine launch kite-towed gyrocopter. German observation platform. Less said about those, better, but yeah, they worked to an extent. Most railway cannons. Yeah. Hull's gas-driven vehicle. Wood gas. Yeah. Hobart's funnies. They were very good, and thus I might do something on them. Bridge laying tanks, flail and pancake roller mine clearing, flamethrower tanks, Churchill tank variants, and kangaroo troop transports. All could be interesting. Yeah. But really, I do try, broadly speaking, to stick to naval, but I suppose I can use the function of the very large river crossing that is D-Day to put them in. Before anyone gets into that one, the definition of amphibious operation means it has to be based from the sea. Because D-Day was run from land and it was basically troops were marshaled and organised on land and went straight to target rather than being based from the sea, it's technically not an amphibious operation, despite being often called the most famous amphibious operation of all time. Welcome to joy that is military and naval operations. Hieroglyph. Until France falls, no amount of U-boats can starve the British into submission. I would say Norway kind of helps with that as well. I don't think there's going to be much. Even if there were literal famine in Britain, the British would not have surrendered. Probably not. Plus, we could probably still get food from Ireland as well, which we'd be importing from, so we have some advantages there. But the U-boats could then have kept the USA effectively out of the war, which was their objective. No. At no point can you effectively keep the USA out of the war. USA infrastructure, the moment they want to start building enough ships, they can build enough ships. They can build more ships than you can sink. I think that was literally the US plan. Even if you give me France and all the U-boats, I think I need, even with snorkels, and you have no hedgehogs there, I don't think I would be able to starve out Britain. I can, however, keep them off the continent, keep the USA off the continent, and even keep the USA production from reaching anyone. Difficult. The thing that really was missing was the French production of U-boats. While French captured aircraft factories were churning out aircraft full force, their chantiers were doing nothing but being built into bomb-proof bunkers. what can I say? The French shipyard workers are slightly more difficult to persuade, difficult to coerce. Hieroglyph. And also, the thing is, with aircraft, you can check it out, and it's compared to a submarine, it's still a complicated, highly technical machine. Compared to a submarine, it's far less complicated, and yeah, the amount of things you can make go wrong in a submarine if you are clever. You can make it so it works quite well until it's far out to sea. Hieroglyph. Air-stolen waters are so much more effective than depth charges because they explode at any depth, but only on contact. No boom. Hydrophone still listening. Boom. Also no problem. But for a different reason. See, when a depth charge hits a sub, it doesn't usually sink it. Most damage, depth charge damage results at worst in forcing the boat to surface. They often force the submarine to surface. Believe it or not, the shock resistance of most submarines is often overstated. Hedgehogs, in contrast, puncture the pressure hole each and every time. Not always. They cause a lot more damage, and they tend to be more focused on target. You remember, you have to launch quite a big spread because you lose the ship itself loses contact with the submarine, which is why I've talked about in a previous video, I think, and possibly this one. You have to have another ship maintaining contact with that submarine while the ships go across with the depth charges. Less than 50 meters, you might blow tank surface and survive, but at depths beyond 50 meters, hedgehogs mean you submerge permanently. Not many submarines were actually diving down below 50 meters if they could avoid it. Hieroglyph. What if they hadn't bothered? Submarines don't use aluminium, so no fleet of bombers from all that steel. Maybe more tanks, but maybe not. Idle shipyards doesn't mean new factories. It just means that you have some shipyard workers available for other duties. Potentially. Somehow I knew you were going to say much earlier than 42, 43. Agreed. Yes, it is. Dugem. Habakkuk. But most do Habakkuk. Really nearly shooting Admiral King? Must do Habakkuk. Yes, that really did happen. The thing is, I think from the way it was described, I think it would have been a flesh wound, so you'd have had a very, very angry, bleeding Admiral King. In which case, Lord Mountbatten might have been killed earlier. I shouldn't be laughing about his death, but that's very rude and nasty of me, and cruel. But there is part of me finding the image of a bleeding Admiral King chasing Louis Mountbatten around the room, threatening to slaughter him quite funny. Because King's first reaction is going to be anger, not seeking medical treatment. It's going to be hunting down the person who did it to him. Banholm. Question is, how would it have looked if that had the German Navy pushed a more efficient and bigger destroyer program? What if Germany had made a tribal class and a Fletcher class? Ships small enough to be built in relatively big numbers, but big enough to actually function as small cruisers, and forced the RN to issue its key units in engagements that could be problematic. In addition to a submarine force, that might not have had as many boats, but at the same time would have had U-boats that the RN had to reckon with. It's an interesting case. It is really an interesting idea. But it's, as I was talking about in the previous video on this one, the thing about destroyers is you build the bigger ones because they're escorting something. If you're building the bigger destroyers as cruiser replacements, which the Germans, to an extent, were doing anyway when they built their bigger destroyments, their sort of pre-tribals, their 1934s, 1936s, the German methodology of armament is different than the British, which is what makes them impractical to an extent as destroyers. They're still good vessels, but as we see at Narvik and various other engagements, they don't necessarily come off the best if it's a gun duel with other destroyers. So you would need to change that philosophy as well. But if you are building tribal and Fletcher class sort of vessels, and maybe you've got some ships with double 5-inch guns and some ships with 5-inch gun, single fire, i.e. Fletcher style single 5 inches and tribal style double 5 inches for, you could be talking a very flexible class. But your problem then becomes, what is the Royal Navy's response? Is the Royal Navy's response to churn out Dido-like cruisers or Arethusa-like cruisers instead of their own tribal destroyers? Because there will be a Royal Navy response. For everything you do, there will be a Royal Navy response. And you have to figure out how that's going to factor into it and what capabilities that's going to do. It could be interesting. Again, it's always logistics for you. It always is logistics. Andrew Cox, the Hispano wasn't reliable enough in 1939. A cannon fighter would have had an unacceptable probability of jams, which is why they initially looked for 12.303, and even when that went in the cannon, it was 2 cannon and 4.303. It's worth noting that you could recock the ME-109's cannon in flight if it jammed. During Jane, what about the American 50 cal then? Or the 13.2mm variant with high explosive ammunition that the Finnish Navy developed just before the war? This is a relatively unknown gun as that FN developed, I presume, the company in Belgium. As Belgium was invaded in 1940 and the gun was new design. Sweden used it in its 13.2mm caliber extensively in the Air Force, while Finland used a gun with 12.7mm barrels, and Romania used a gun as well. The Finnish guns were exported from Sweden, which had a licensed production setup. The guns fit in the same dimensions as a 50 cal Browning, but is reinforced to handle the 13.2mm Hotchkiss ammunition. The gun is known as the 13.2mm Akan M39 in Sweden. It was in use up until the retirement of the Viggen in the 2000s as a substitute training weapon for the 30mm Aden cannon pods. All the guns were changed to 50 cal post-war as this ammunition was much cheaper, and frontline aircraft all had the guns over to the bigger cannons. Andrew Cox, engineer. Until there was actual combat experience, everyone assumed that 8.303s would be good enough. Remember, the change to stress metal skins was only just happening a few years earlier, so there was little experience of how tough modern designs were. The thing is, Andrew, they were thinking about 20mm cannons a lot earlier. The problem with putting them in was actually keeping them warm. And this is why normally when I start talking about them, I do talk about twin-engined aircraft, or I talk about you have to put them close to the engine to keep them warm enough in the early designs. That's the only way. And set up some sort of synchronization so they can fire through the propeller. But of course, that then affects your propeller and your fettering and your performance, because otherwise you shred your own propeller. So you don't want to do that. You want to stick them in the wings, away from the propeller. And also that gives them a far easier and it's a far less technical system. Or you have a twin-engine aircraft. And that's often the point I make about the Royal Navy. If they'd had, especially if they had gone the Admiral class for their bases of their carriers, rather than Courageous and Glorious and Furious, if they'd used Hood's sisters, they would have been bigger. They seem to have been talking about possibly deck edge lifts or something similar to that, like what happened in Saratoga and Lexington. In which case, they could well have ended up going the twin-engined route, because that would have been sensible again for the Navy, a naval aircraft, especially for what the Royal Navy is looking for. Because remember, the Royal Navy's criteria is long-range strike and safety at night. Twin-engined, yes, there are is theoretically is more viable for that. I know someone's going to come back to go the engine sets and go, oh, they have issues. Yes, but if you're a Royal Navy admiral thinking about it, you're going to think, well, none of our ships go to sea with a single engine. They all have multiple engines, or multiple gearing and boilers and all these sort of things. So yeah, twin engine is probably better. In which case, you could end up with an aircraft fielding cannon quite a bit earlier, because, as they did with Beaufighter and various other things, and I think mosquitoes, you can stick them in the fuselage, which is heated, to keep the crew okay, and that will keep the cannon okay at high altitudes. It'd be interesting. It would be interesting. Anyway, Ben Wilson. The Hunt class and the Flag class were ordered in 1939 and not 1938. None delivered until 1940. My response to that, Dr. Hi, Ben. Have you seen my response to your earlier comment along the same line? Yours sincerely. Now, of course, on that the comment, and that's in the previous video to this, I had responded that they are, or the DNC is ordered to start producing specifications. in 1938. The hull is selected in 1939, and the first orders are placed in 1939 in July, and then they're delivered as quickly as they can be. And in a nice way, the Hunt class are also, and as I get into the escorts video, I'll talk about the Hunt class are also based off a sloop. The Flower class are based off the sloop experience. The thing is, these are all based off what's been going on, and it takes time to get these ships into service. Now, I'm not going to go into and repeat exactly what I said in the previous video, but you should find a link to it down below. Ben Wilson. Early in the war, until late in 1940, Germans had a self-handicap. Their torpedoes were not reliable. No one's torpedoes were reliable. But mostly they were trying to deal with certain merchant ships on the surface. Crazy Lurker. So much I want to get into. We'll get to the other version first. Thank you. Humanish. Allies. 72,000 sailors killed, naval and merchant marine, around 36,000 each. 3,500 merchant ships sunk, 175 warships lost, about 750 aircraft lost. Axis, about 30,000 German sailors lost, a total of 800 submarines sunk. 17 of those were Italian, another 500 men lost in them. 47 Axis surface vessels lost. Apparently, they must be counting some Channel and French coastal losses in there. Don't know. More possibly. If you want to play the game, what would happen if Germany didn't bother building 750 subs? Actually, results then would probably be much worse. Sure, they could build more tanks and tank destroyers, half-tracks and trucks, but not ton for ton of steel. Their plants were already at capacity, but the Allies would be relieved of a far greater resource burden. For every extra tanks the Germans could have fielded, the Allies could have afforded to ship 3 more tanks to Russia than they did, with little worry for losses on the way. They could put far more aircraft in land battles. They could concentrate on building carriers and assault ships, and even do a cross-channel in 1942 after all. I doubt they could have. I would love to see them try a cross-channel in 1942, but I doubt they could have done that then. The very idea of war is gambit. If you don't play and stay home, you'll certainly not win. Could they ever have won the Battle Atlantic? Probably not. Unless you screw around, muck around with the timelines, start the war with way more U-boats, build Type 21s and get snorkels sooner act. But that does not mean it was not worth trying. In 1940, they could not have predicted the game-changing technologies and weapon tactics that destroyed them by 1944. To an extent, my point here is that actually, the thing is, the version of the Z plan they go with doesn't make sense. I'm trying to come up with a better plan for them. Because, yes, they have to do it. They have to fight the Battle Atlantic, but there's better options for how to fight it. And not fighting it at all does save them something. Does it necessarily help the Allies out as much as you think? Well, here's the thing. The Allies still have to escort such ships. Because if you have any submarines, and if you build some submarines and concentrate on building the really high-techy ones, the Allies still have to escort convoys. So they still have to put resources in that. They just don't lose ships necessarily at the same rate. But as ever, it's a judgment call. And this is one of those things where there is no really right answer. You can make an argument whatever way you like based on the information, because there is a lot of information available, and because it all depends on how you value what they're fighting and what kind of war operations they're doing and what you think would have been more successful. And ultimately, it was a great sacrifice for the Allies, but they were never going to lose it because they were never going to allow themselves to lose it. They were always going to pay whatever was necessary to win it. And you also have to remember that the stats of those lives lost includes everything that happens anywhere near the Atlantic, including, I think, the coastal convoys for Britain and the stuff going up and down the American coast and all sorts of things. It's a truly large and traumatic conflict. It's not quite the largest theatre of World War II. I know there are some people who put that out. But honestly, the Pacific is a larger theatre. It's going to be. Although it only really takes place in the Western Pacific, whereas the Battle Atlantic stretches across the entirety of the Atlantic. but in the Pacific War, it's north to south of the Western, and into the section of Southeast Asia and Indian Ocean really is one theatre. It can almost be considered, and should be practically considered. Whereas the Atlantic, yes, German submarines make it into the Caribbean, but they're not there that frequently. And yes, German submarines make it down into the South Atlantic, and surface raiders, of course, make it down in the South Atlantic far more often. But again, they're not really as significant a presence down there as you have north to south with fighting the Japanese and the Japanese fighting the American submarine threat. One of the interesting things I find in World War II is that when looking at the submarine war, we tend to focus on the capability, the actions of two nations, the Americans and the Germans, in terms of their submarines. And we miss out what the Italian submarines do. We miss out what the British submarines do. We miss out what the other Allied submarines do. We miss out what the Russian submarines do. And the Japanese submarines. They're all interesting, all have different capabilities. The anti-submarine war is one of the most complicated and nuanced conflicts of World War II. But, and this is the hill I will die on if I need to, if anyone tries to say that the navies involved didn't see it coming and weren't doing their best to prepare for it they could within the context of their own scenarios, you are massively doing a disservice to the professionalism of the people involved. The point there, the key is in the context of the services, the context of the scenario they're in. The Royal Navy is doing the best it can within the provisions, and I get into this far more in the next video. And I will probably get into this far more in the comment in the next video of this series, but in the next video that I'm doing the comments on, the Battle of the Atlantic, the escort force. They have, because they are planning for it. The Royal Navy has one of the largest and most capable submarine services in the world in the during the interwar period and for much of World War II. Yes, we don't hear about them much because mostly they're focusing on the Mediterranean and the North Sea and doing various operations there, and so they don't get the spectacular kills. They're mostly doing intelligence duties and monitoring stuff. But they are doing some really, really critical operations, some really clever stuff. The Royal Navy has many admirals who have come from the submarine service. They have a very technologically advanced submarine service. Yes, it's less advanced in some areas than some of the other powers, but it's also more advanced in other areas. Everyone, it depends on what they focus on their development of. So they knew what they were likely to be facing. Yes, they were guilty of overestimating the capability of Aztec, but they were also testing it, and it had shown in exercises that they worked. Now, remember, I have said before, there is a problem with exercises and using them to judge systems in that they can produce a confirmation bias. And that seems to be what happens with the exercises. They do confirm Aztec works, even though it might not be argued it did work. So, as well, the main thing they find out, and they do understand this before World War II, and they get into this a lot during World War II, is that it's going to require multiple escorts to engage a submarine. As I've said before, what catches the Royal Navy on the hop is when war happens, for all their plans. It also catches the Germans on the hop because look at how many submarines they have prepared to go to war. It catches the Italians on the hop because they would have been better prepared. It catches everyone on the hop. But they were all preparing. So if you want to if you want to make a fair assessment of what their understanding of the war was going to be, you have to look at their preparations and their plans. Not necessarily what they had when they went to war, because you go to war with what you have, but what they were preparing, what they were building, and also the timescales they were working to. Okay, the Royal Navy, whilst 1932, and again I'll be talking this more, 1932, you'd seen the 10-year rule dropped to an extent. The Treasury was still very keen to limit defence spending, as it was considered ruinous to spend too much money on defence when you should be paying down the debt and spending on other things which would boost the economy or reducing taxation. All these things, lovely for the long-term economy. But that means that the Royal Navy always is having to justify itself. And one of the problems you have when you have a significant maritime infrastructure, as Britain does, is justifying starting building smaller ships. And it's only once you get past really 1936, 1937, they're seeing the issues coming up with Germany, they're seeing the issues coming up with Japan, and they're seeing the issues with Italy. And remember, only one of these nations are they really thinking that they're going to need a large convoy fleet for. Japan can be sealed off in the Pacific as far as the British are concerned. That's what Singapore's supposed to be for. We can all understand the realities of that idea. That's fine, and how it works in practice. But that was the theory. Italy could be sealed off in the Mediterranean. That's what Gibraltar is for. And to be honest, that works pretty well. And the Suez Canal and Alexandria. That's what that's for. The only one which you'd be looking at, a threat you'd be looking at for a convoy fleet, is Germany. You look at their submarine strength and how they're building their submarines and how many they can churn out a year, and you start working out how many convoy escorts you need to start churning out. And you draw up plans for converting your older destroyers, for maybe building more sloops, all these things. You do that. But the point is, that is one part of one threat nation. Britain didn't know which one would start the war. We could have another conversation. We could say, okay, well, Britain isn't building any aircraft carriers or anything in 1939 or battleships, but the war starts with Japan, and they have no capital ship units coming in, and then they're caught completely on the hop for fielding and supporting Pacific Fleet, and they have to do a crash building program of these vessels. We know they don't. We know they had them on production. We could do something similar about the Italians. They're fighting the Italians, and they suddenly find they need fast-moving cruisers to support the fast-flowing operations and campaigns in the Mediterranean. They also need carriers. Again, they're building these. We go for Germany. Well, they find themselves fighting a war against submarines. They find themselves fighting against a war against significant surface raiders. The significant surface raiders, of course, need a carrier battleship or carrier capital ship task force to hunt down, the carrier to provide the search and hopefully the damage to slow the vessel down, because that's the theory at the time, because they're not sure if they can or can't sink, because they hope carrier aircraft can sink enemy ships, but no one's actually tried it in combat yet. And there's a bit difference of doing in full-up combat versus doing it in tests where ships aren't crewed or maneuvering or having damage control being done. It's on theory, but practice, we have to do practice first, and you have a capital ship to go and kill it. Okay. And then for the anti-submarine convoys, you need anti-submarine escorts and the convoys. You need a whole load of escorts. Well, they have a plan. They're building all of these things. That's why they're building all of them. They are building a balanced fleet to deal with a range of threats they are looking at, because they can't afford to focus in on one thing. They can't do that. It would make their lives a lot easier if they could, but they can't afford to. Anyway, I hope that answers your questions. Once again, we have come to the last slides of this video, and I will do the Battle of Atlantic ones. I will record tomorrow, but this one and the Battle Atlantic will go live on Monday, because otherwise I make YouTube mad if I have too many videos go live on one day. Anyway, thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'm going to quickly go back to this and say, please, as I said at the beginning, if you're watching this, please consider subscribing, pressing that bell down there. Remember, if the bet with my aunt, but mainly for bragging rights, but also for that picture of them both, my aunt and uncle, wearing Blackburn face masks, is 13,000 subscribers, which is double what I have got already by December the 31st. So it's pretty much an impossible task because it's 90 days and I'm a naval history channel and I doubt I'll make it. But that doesn't mean I'm going to give up easy and I'm not going to try my darndest to get there. But that depends on you. And thank you very much to everyone who has subscribed. Thank you to everyone who has joined Discord. Thank you to everyone who's a patron. Thank you to everyone who's joined this channel and gets to use the emojis, because I love seeing them in the chat. I do. And thank you to everyone who has goes to Spreadshirt and decides to buy something. It's very, very kind of you. And I said there are more coming. There's an HMS Unicorn pictured one and all sorts of things. Thank you very much, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. Take care.